In 2017, the New York Times ran a bombshell story about a secret UFO program at the Pentagon called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP. But what if I told you that the article, unintentionally, got a major detail wrong? They got the $22 million budget right, and that it was secured by then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and that there was a program at the Pentagon called ATIP that looked into UAP cases involving the U.S. military. It turns out there was another ATIP, not at the Pentagon, but at the Defense Intelligence Agency. And that in order to stay a secret, they created the nickname ATIP to use in unclassified documents. The program that the New York Times reported on was actually called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, or AAWSAP. And they investigated a hell of a lot more than just UAPs. I'm talking intelligently controlled orbs and lights, animals that shouldn't exist, poltergeists, mythical creatures, holes in the sky, and so much more. In this video, we're going to learn all about AAWSAP and the research they conducted at a little place called Skinwalker Ranch. I do have a couple of disclaimers before we jump in. Number one, everything you're about to hear either came from Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, written by George Knapp and the two most senior researchers at AAWSAP, Dr. Jim Lacatski and Dr. Colm Kelleher. Episode 12, Part 1 of Weaponized, or Episode 12, Part 2 of Weaponized, where George and Jeremy talk with Dr. Colm Kelleher. Disclaimer number 2, what you're about to hear will undoubtedly push you beyond the limits of what you can believe is true. And that's fine. Even Jeremy Corbell has said that he has an allergy to some of these stories because they're just so hard to believe. That being said, everyone who worked in AAWSAP had either a TS or TS-SCI clearance. Most of them were or are currently working in senior level positions in the intelligence community and or are highly respected academics, researchers, and leaders in their fields. You literally could not ask for a more straightforward, sane, and credible group of people. Just try to keep that in mind when your head starts spinning and you tell yourself there's no way any of this could be true. Now, if you're ready, let's begin. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman decided to trade in the hustle and bustle of their daily lives for those of cattle ranchers and purchased a 480-acre ranch in northeastern Utah. Nestled in the Uinta Basin, it seemed like an idyllic place for the Shermans to make an honest living while raising their teenage son and 8-year-old daughter. What the Shermans didn't know is that for hundreds of years, UFOs, animal mutilations, and other paranormal activity were commonplace for the residents of the basin, and the Shermans would soon be able to count themselves amongst their ranks. Over the next 2 years, the Sherman family fought for their sanity and survival as they endured an endless barrage of bizarre and at times traumatic experiences, both on and off of the ranch. Things like joy, a sense of comfort, and a peaceful night's rest were luxuries that they could no longer afford. And by 1996, they could no longer afford the ranch either. That was because they kept losing their expensive cattle to unexplained mutilations, disappearances, and deaths. The Shermans were desperate to sell the ranch and move far, far away from the hell they called home. So it made little sense for the Shermans to do a news story about their harrowing experiences at the ranch, but in a strange stroke of luck, turned out to be the best thing they could have done. Their story caught the attention of a wealthy Nevada businessman and longtime paranormal enthusiast, Robert Bigelow. A year earlier, Bigelow had founded the National Institute of Discovery Science, or NIDS, to scientifically study UFOs and other paranormal phenomena. Where others saw a real estate black hole, Bigelow saw the opportunity for a 24/7 NIDS laboratory and was more than happy to take the ranch off the Shermans' hands. To learn more about what happened during the NIDS years, check out Hunt for the Skinwalker, written by George Knapp and NIDS field investigator Dr. Colm Kelleher. The book details the research and personal experiences of the NIDS team at the ranch. which was now called Skinwalker Ranch after the Navajo legend. It's definitely worth the read, and it's also widely believed that AAWSAP never would have happened if it weren't for that book. In 2007, Dr. Jim Lacatski, one of the top scientists at the Defense Intelligence Agency's Defense Warning Office, read Hunt for the Skinwalker and was very intrigued. Of particular interest to him were the reports of nuts and bolts craft that were flying around the ranch in U.S. airspace with impunity, and no one seemed to be doing anything about it. Dr. Lacatski said, quote, "I was legitimately interested in this as useful to the military and useful to my particular group, which was looking at possible threats to new weapon systems. That's what attracted my attention," end quote. Dr. Lacatski shared the book with a few of his colleagues, including one who, in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, is referred to as Jonathan Axelrod. Sidebar here. I am 99.9% sure that Jonathan Axelrod is Jay Stratton, one of the U.S. government's highest-ranking and most experienced UFO hunters, and is currently a senior analyst at the Office of Naval Intelligence. The reason why I point this out is because one look at this guy's resume tells you that if you're going to believe anyone about what happened at the ranch, it's him. In the book, Axelrod is a senior aerospace engineer in naval intelligence, lead investigator of the Tic Tac UAP incident, and well-versed in investigating anomalies. Jay Stratton used to be a senior aerospace engineer at ONI. He's also since come out as the lead investigator on the Tic Tac UAP incident and is widely regarded as the U.S. government's top UAP investigator, aka well-versed in investigating anomalies. But there's more. In Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, Dr. Lacatski gives Axelrod Hunt for the Skinwalker, who then reads it in his downtime while on a deployment to Iraq.
Jim Lacatski says, hey, basically I made the comment something to the effect of, I'd love to see one with my own eyes. And he hands me your book. And I throw the book in my backpack and literally took it to Iraq with me. So I read that book in the green zone and in my downtime.
In the same interview, Jay Stratton acknowledges that he worked with AAWSAP. And in the book, Axelrod worked with AAWSAP in a contractor and consultant capacity. Jonathan Axelrod is Jay Stratton, okay? I could be wrong. If I am, I will gladly admit it and correct it in the future. But I'm so certain of this that I'm just going to call Axelrod Stratton in this video. So anyway, after some discussions at the DIA, Dr. Lacatski reached out to Bigelow and asked if he could come check out the ranch, and Bigelow accepted. On July 26, 2007, Dr. Lacatski arrived at Skinwalker Ranch, and within 45 minutes of being there, had his own experience. Dr. Lacatski, Bigelow, and the ranch managers were all sitting around a table just having a little chit-chat in the ranch manager's home, when suddenly, Dr. Lacatski sees a metallic object just appear in the kitchen, roughly 10 feet from where they were sitting. He said the closest thing he can compare it to is the object on the cover of Tubular Bells. Without saying a word, he watched the object silently hover and rotate in the kitchen for roughly 30 seconds before it just disappeared. As is fairly typical of the phenomena at the ranch, no one else saw it, or even had any clue that Dr. Lacatski had seen something. So Dr. Lacatski went back to D.C. and told then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid about his experience at the ranch and his idea for a program to investigate and scientifically research the UFO phenomena. Luckily for him, Senator Reid was already very familiar with the goings-on at Skinwalker Ranch. In the early days of NIDS, Senator Reid attended one of the meetings of their world-class scientific advisory board, which at that time included engineer and father of the CIA's remote viewing program, Dr. Hal Puthoff, computer scientist, longtime UFO investigator and author, Jacques Vallée, former astronaut and U.S. Senator Harrison Schmitt, head of the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, Dr. John Mack, and former U.S. Army intelligence officer, Dr. John Alexander. Senator Reid was so impressed by the board and their approach to scientifically researching the phenomena that he stayed in touch with Bigelow and the NIDS team over the years. So needless to say, Senator Reed didn't need any convincing, and he arranged a meeting for Dr. Lacatski to pitch his idea to the senators who could move this program along. With the help of bipartisan Senate leadership and 2 DIA directors, Dr. Lacatski acquired $22 million in funding for a new DIA program called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, or AAWSAP. Through his new company, Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, or BASS, Bigelow submitted a proposal and was ultimately awarded the AAWSAP contract 2 weeks later. As previously stated, due to the highly sensitive nature of the program, everyone in AAWSAP and BASS had to acquire TS or TS-SCI clearance. For their department administrator, BASS hired biochemist and longtime NIDS field investigator, Dr. Colm Kelleher. Dr. Kelleher then hired Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Kurth, who was the commanding officer of the Red Devils, the oldest and most decorated fighter squadron in the Marine Corps. Lieutenant Colonel Kurth also happened to be part of the USS Strike Group Nimitz during the now infamous Tic Tac UAP incident. The first order of business for the AAWSAP BASS team was to establish a baseline for the best possible aerospace performance capabilities that they could compare all of their UAP performance data to. That baseline study was called Project Physics and was subcontracted to EarthTech International out of Austin, Texas. The founder and CEO of EarthTech is Dr. Hal Puthoff, engineer, head of the CIA's remote viewing program, member of the NIDS Scientific Advisory Board, and would later be a co-founder of To the Stars Academy. The result of Project Physics was 38 highly acclaimed Defense Intelligence Reference Documents, or DIRDs, that defined both the current and projected state-of-the-art in aerospace technology. The next step was to collect the data. And boy, did they have their work cut out for them. The field investigators wanted to leave no stone unturned in their data collection process. And the fact of the matter was, there was a lot of weird stuff going on in addition to the UAP sightings. They had no idea whether or not any of that weird stuff had something to do with the UAPs. So they decided to database everything they came across. UAPs, orbs, lights, holes in the sky, poltergeists, sightings of impossible creatures, etc. And then, after further analysis, determine what should and shouldn't be included in the UAP database. That's where the misconception that AAWSAP was studying werewolves and poltergeists comes from. They weren't. It just so happens that a lot of the times, UAP sightings and paranormal experiences seem to go hand in hand. In July of 2009, Jay Stratton, Jim Costigan, and David Wilson were brought to the ranch for their expertise in sensor technology to try and track the phenomena that had successfully eluded countless other experts for years. It was a pleasant 75 degrees that night as they began their walk of the property to scope out the terrain. About a half mile into their hike, the temperature suddenly dropped 20 degrees, and the men just froze. Stratton silently motioned for them to take a few steps back, and when they did, the air was warm again. Stratton then motioned for them to take a few steps forward, and in the same spot, they were hit with the cold wall of air again. They performed this maneuver 3 more times before shrugging it off as a weather front and continuing on their way toward one of the ranch's homesteads. Weather front or not, the men sensed something in the air. With each step they took, their level of fear grew, but no one wanted to be the first to admit it. Jim Costigan had night vision goggles, and he kept checking their surroundings, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, Costigan, in a strained whisper, commanded them to stop, his night vision goggles fixed on the homestead 50 yards ahead. Stratton and Wilson didn't see anything that was cause for concern, but Costigan, through his night vision goggles, could clearly make out a roughly 8-foot-tall, black oval shape dead ahead. Even though they couldn't see it, Stratton and Wilson shared Costigan's instinctual fear that continuing toward the oval would mean certain death. Without a word, the three men carefully retreated back the way they came, feeling their visceral terror diminish with each step until it dissipated entirely. Unfortunately, their ordeal wasn't over. Jacques Vallée coined the term the hitchhiker effect to describe a phenomenon that's not only common to visitors of the ranch, but to people who've had encounters with UAPs and paranormal experiences. It had been happening to the NIDS team at the ranch for years, and within days of returning home, it happened to Jay Stratton and his family too. It began, as it often does, with his wife seeing a black humanoid figure walking toward their bedroom one night. Next came the orbs of light that harassed the Stratton children in their beds as they tried to sleep. Jay wasn't home long before having to go out on another mission, but his wife continued seeing shadow figures in their home and heard strange banging noises in the kitchen at night. One night, as Mrs. Stratton went around the home turning off the lights for the evening, she glanced outside and saw a wolf, standing on two legs with its arms crossed, leaning against a tree in their backyard, and staring menacingly right back at her. Naturally, Mrs. Stratton thought she'd lost her mind, or was hallucinating, but when she looked away and looked back, the wolf was still there, still staring at her. She stood there, frozen in astonishment, until the wolf abruptly turned and ran, on two legs, out of sight. Not wanting to distress Jay or the boys, she kept the sighting to herself. That is, until a few days later, at 10:30 in the morning, the boys spotted a wolf in their backyard, standing on two legs and staring menacingly at them before running off and out of their sight. When Mrs. Stratton returned home a few hours later, the boys excitedly told her about their experience, which, to her horror, sounded identical to the apparition she had seen. Upon further investigation, they found fresh, claw-like marks in the tree the wolf had been leaning against. Although the book didn't go into detail, it said that both Costigan and Wilson's families also began experiencing very similar activity when they returned home from the ranch. Juliet Witt is a, quote, superb Pentagon operational test and evaluation analyst and DoD target sensor specialist well-versed in counterintelligence operations. Her plan was to walk as much of the property as possible, once during the day and once at night, and hopefully document some of the reported anomalies in pictures and video. The daytime walk was uneventful, and that night the decision was made to go sit in a pasture near Homestead 2, where a number of anomalies had been witnessed and recorded in the past. The moon was so bright that night that the team, comprised of Bigelow, Kelleher, and Witt, didn't even need flashlights to navigate the terrain. They arrived at the pasture without incident and set up some folding chairs in a configuration that gave them a 360-degree view of the area. After about an hour, Bigelow and Kelleher got up to do a routine perimeter check, and Witt, not wanting to be left alone, joined Kelleher. Witt and Kelleher made their way toward the west side of the homestead when suddenly everything went dead quiet. They spun around to find a creature the size of a 150-pound pig gliding right toward them. There should have been some kind of audible sound from this creature moving through the grass, but even as it passed within 30 feet of them, there was only silence. Kelleher described the creature as having a series of dinosaur-like spines on its back and a large, flattened, beaver-like tail. Due to being so caught off guard and the sighting lasting only a few seconds, Witt didn't capture any of it in pictures or video. Witt left the ranch on schedule later that same day, taking with her several sprigs of sage and heather from the property as a memento of her visit. Little did she know, she was already bringing the ranch home with her. Within a week of arriving back home in Virginia, it began. Late one night, Witt heard loud, unexplained banging noises coming from her kitchen and heavy footsteps on the stairs. The following night, she woke to the terrified screams of her roommate, who cried out that someone was standing over his bed. A week later, Whit called Kelleher to report the incidents, along with the terrifying attack she had just experienced. While slowly backing out of her driveway, she said a gigantic bird, resembling an oversized owl, had swooped down and attacked her car. Stunned, she hit the brakes and looked around, trying to see what the heck this thing was. That's when the quote-unquote owl swooped down again, hitting her windshield and the hood of her car with tremendous force. Whit hit the gas and narrowly avoided a third strike from the impossibly huge owl. It's hard to say which part of the experience was the most disturbing for her. The massive size of the creature, the alarming degree of aggression it displayed, or the scrapes and gouges it left in the paint of her car. A few weeks later, her roommate moved out after 2 wine bottles inexplicably flew out of the wine rack, across the room they were sitting in, and smashed into the wall opposite them. Now alone in the home, Whit would wake to find shadow-like figures around her bed and saw different colored orbs all throughout the house. She had lived in this house for years and is adamant that nothing like this had ever happened until she came back from the ranch, and the activity continues to this day. Dr. Kelleher found that the hitchhiker effect bore a striking resemblance to the transmission of infectious diseases amongst people, with the phenomenon being the infectious disease and the symptoms being the explosion of paranormal activity that happens in the immediate environment of the newly infected individual. Take Jay Stratton and his family, for example. Jay was the one who was infected at the ranch. Then, within days of bringing it home and infecting his family, they began to experience symptoms. And within weeks of that, their friends, family, neighbors, and other people they had close contact with also started to experience symptoms. This infection happened to countless researchers and visitors to the ranch, including Robert Bigelow, George Knapp, and the security guards. But the hitchhiker effect isn't unique to the ranch. Interestingly enough, the hitchhiker effect was reported in a 1970 study conducted by the prestigious Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, in which researchers attempted to measure and study the psychic abilities of Uri Geller. Quote, Peter Crane, who was a team leader at LLNL, a PhD scientist with TS/SCI clearances, and some of the others in the Livermore group quickly found themselves involved in more strangeness than they could handle. In the days and weeks that followed, they began to feel that they were collectively possessed by some kind of tormenting, teasing, hallucination-inducing spirit. They all would be in a laboratory together, setting up some experiment, or one of the fellows and his wife and children would be at home, just sitting around, when suddenly, there in the middle of the room, would be a weird, hovering, almost comically stereotypical image of a flying saucer. There were sometimes animals, fantastic animals from the ecstatic lore of shamans, such as the large raven-like birds that were seen traipsing through the yards of several members of the group. Other scientists and their families saw orbs and black shadowy forms in their homes. End quote. There were actually a lot of interesting overlaps between the events of the Lawrence Livermore study and those of Skinwalker Ranch. First of all, Dr. Hal Puthoff was involved in both. Maybe he's the cause. The quote-unquote victims all had high-level security clearances and worked in senior position levels in several government agencies. Both had a trigger for the phenomena, Uri Geller or the ranch. The victims and their families started experiencing paranormal phenomena following exposure to said trigger. Both experienced balls of light, large mythical animals, and poltergeist activity that seemed to be centered around bedrooms, hallways, and the backyards of their homes. Weird. As previously mentioned, AAWSAP and Bass didn't just study the ranch. The following case is from California. On the evening of July 5th, 2009, Buck Scarsdale, a retired detective with 25 years of experience, was enjoying the beautiful warm night with his girlfriend Joanna and son Bo on the front porch of their home. Needing a pick-me-up, Buck went inside to get a cup of coffee. Standing at a window in the darkened kitchen, Buck immediately noticed 7 huge lights in his orchard 500 feet away. He described the lights as being a weird bluish color and bright, like an LED times 100. Sorry, Oliver's playing with his toy over there. Anyway, his first thought was that someone was trying to steal his orchard plants. So he dropped his coffee and ran outside to find Joanna and Bo staring at the same lights. They too thought someone had brazenly driven a well-lit trailer into their orchard and was stealing their fruit trees. But after 3 to 4 minutes of watching the silent, motionless lights with no other sign of activity, they decided to get a closer look. The trio hopped into their farm truck and slowly drove toward the lights with their headlights off. But as soon as they reached the area, the lights vanished. No one saw them blink out or a large object move out of the orchard. They were just gone. After grabbing some flashlights, they returned to the spot where the lights had been. Carefully, they walked around searching for tracks or any other traces of who or what had just been there, when suddenly, a loud click noise broke the silence. They all froze and just stared at each other, waiting for one of them to offer an explanation, when a second click rang out from the dense brush 20 yards away. Now on their hands and knees, they slowly crept toward the brush, when a third click rang out, this time from several yards behind them. Then a fourth click from a different direction. On the fifth click, they got up and ran to the truck and floored it to the house. Back on the porch, Buck received a message from his brother Roger, saying that he was stopping by after leaving a family gathering. Roger was a diehard skeptic with a PhD, and they thought for sure he would have a logical explanation. After hearing the trio recount the bizarre events of the evening, Roger wanted to go and check out the area for himself, so he and Buck headed back out to the orchard where the lights had been. As they looked around, Roger didn't think there was any kind of funny business going on whatsoever. That is, until he saw a hole open up in the sky and an oblong object fly into the opening, which then closed swiftly behind it. Just after midnight on July 10th, another event occurred. An unsuspecting Buck once again entered his darkened kitchen to find a bright bluish light out in his orchard. He called Joanna and Bo into the kitchen, who confirmed that they could see it too. Buck and Bo immediately went to investigate, and right as they stepped onto the front porch, the light dimmed significantly, and they could see what appeared to be a large wall-like structure behind it. As soon as they stepped off of the porch, the light disappeared. Roger arrived 15 minutes later and went with Buck into the orchard to look for tracks. Once they made it to the spot where they thought this light had been, the bright floating light reappeared 300 feet from them, which they estimated to be 5 feet in diameter and self-contained rather than emanating from a source. The brothers just stared at the silent, bright light hovering in front of them for roughly 5 minutes before it disappeared. Now here's where it gets weird. What am I talking about? The whole thing's weird. Joanna and Bo, they had been on the front porch the entire time watching them, and they didn't see any light. What the what? The Scarsdales had a few more of these encounters in the weeks that followed, and on 2 separate occasions, Bass investigators came out to interview them, conduct surveillance, and hopefully gather some evidence. Nothing happened on their first trip, but their second trip was a bit of a different story. In the week or so between the two, the Scarsdales had had a few other experiences that were pretty similar, with a few notable exceptions. On one occasion, Buck managed to record a video that allegedly showed a pair of non-human legs walk in front of the truck headlights, which they didn't see at the time, but could make out when they reviewed the video back at the house. The next day, Buck woke to find that everything on his phone had been deleted. not just the leg video, everything. Of course, this is all purely anecdotal, and we have no idea whether or not that really happened. However, that is in line with some of what the Bass team experienced when they returned to the Scarsdale home on July 23rd. The Bass team had returned to conduct some more surveillance and to re-interview the witnesses, which was standard procedure for their investigations. By 9:30 that night, all 3 investigators saw 6 to 8 brightly lit circular orbs that were only visible through night vision goggles. So I'm not sure what they mean by brightly lit. A lot of other strange things happened in the days the investigators were there, including many instances of their camcorders being mysteriously switched off or their batteries inexplicably drained. One more notable incident occurred on the night of July 27th. Around 9:30 that night, Buck spotted through his night vision goggles a black object hovering above one of his greenhouses. Buck relayed this to the investigators, who immediately trained their night vision goggles in that direction, but couldn't confirm his sighting. About an hour later, a member of the Bass team, identified only as investigator number 2, saw through his night vision goggles what appeared to be a black object hovering above one of the pastures. The craft wasn't visible to the naked eye, and they failed to capture it on video. In addition to the sightings, the Scarsdales reported having unexplained experiences, such as hearing the fridge door open and shut when no one was in the kitchen, doors opening and closing at night when they were in bed, and flashes of light on the property and in the house. This next case occurred a few years before AAWSAP started, but the Bass team followed up with the victims and investigated it. This case began the night of May 1st, 2005, roughly 50 miles southeast of Bend, Oregon. Ron Becker, a 48-year-old biotechnologist, and his daughter were driving on Highway 20 to Mr. Becker's brother's house. From the passenger seat, his daughter suddenly spotted 3 bright blue orbs flying around in a field next to them. As soon as she had the conscious thought of, what the heck is that? The orbs suddenly flew right toward the car at a high rate of speed, with 2 of the orbs passing through the car. One went right across the dashboard, and the other went into Mr. Becker's left arm, through his chest, and exited out of his right bicep. Within minutes, he felt very nauseous and generally unwell, and very scared. In fact, too scared to even stop the car. The Beckers reported that the remaining 45-minute leg of their trip somehow took 3 hours. Mr. Becker had to wake up early for a conference the next morning, so as soon as they got to his brother's house, Mr. Becker went straight to bed. Upon waking up that morning, he felt refreshed and rejuvenated, but throughout the conference, he felt increasingly nauseous and dizzy. There was also an intense red rash that had developed on the left side of his face, and he noticed that his hair and eyebrow on the left side of his head were falling out. His condition only continued to deteriorate to the point of having diminished eyesight and hearing on his left side for a while. Mr. Becker, who prior to the Blue Orb incident had always been highly active and never had health problems, was now a shadow of his former self, struggling with inexplicable weight gain, fatigue, and pain. 2 years later, Mr. Becker was diagnosed with breast cancer, which is very rare in men, on the left side of his chest. Among other things, that cancer has been linked to radiation exposure, and the symptoms he had immediately following the incident are consistent with radiation exposure. For years after the incident, his blood work continued to show pronounced abnormalities. Quote, the Bass Group concluded that there was enough circumstantial evidence to indicate that the sudden passage of the blue orb through his body had had an adverse effect on the man's physiology at multiple levels and hence was a direct threat to his health. End quote. Thankfully, his daughter didn't suffer any negative health consequences from the event. However, she and her roommates began experiencing a plethora of paranormal activity in their home that had never happened before. Care to guess what that was? That's right. Dark, shadowy figures standing over their beds, heavy footsteps going up and down their stairs, and bizarre poltergeist activity. Now, remember the experience that Stratton, Costigan, and Wilson had on the ranch in July 2009 with that dark oval? Predictably, all three men and their families started experiencing activity consistent with the hitchhiker effect. But unfortunately, Jim Costigan, who was the only one to actually see the oval, and his wife Layla had their own blue orb incident within 2 months of him returning home. Around 10 o'clock one night, the couple set out on their nightly 2-mile walk with their dog. They were leisurely strolling around their quiet Maryland suburb when Layla, fixated on something over Jim's shoulder, said, "What the heck is that?" Jim spun around and, to his horror, saw a blue orb 20 yards away that was coming straight toward them. Before either of them could react, the blue orb suddenly sped up and shot right in between them, lightly grazing Layla's shoulder. I bet you all have at least one family member or friend who's like a freak of nature and somehow never manages to get sick. Well, that was Layla. Was. But after sleeping in rather late that morning, she woke up to her entire body aching and feeling like she had the flu. Jim had to go to work, but promised to call and check up on her. However, she didn't pick up the phone at all that day. When Jim got home from work, he was shocked to find Layla still in bed, with zero energy and a severe headache. When her symptoms hadn't improved a week later, Layla went to the doctor and underwent all kinds of tests, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. After dozens more visits with pathologists, neurologists, and other specialists, Layla was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, an autoimmune disease that attacks the thyroid gland. And it wasn't just blue orbs that appeared to have a link to cancer and autoimmune diseases. Quote, independent of Skinwalker Ranch, the AAWSAP reports delivered to DIA described a number of individuals who came in close contact with UAPs and shortly thereafter suffered from a range of immune system-related symptoms, including changes in immune cell number and immune function as measured by alterations in circulating blood neutrophil lymphocyte ratios, sudden autoimmune antigen expression, and increased circulating liver enzyme levels. End quote. Around midnight on May 8, 2009, 49-year-old Derek Jones was alerted to something in his backyard by his dogs, who were going nuts. As soon as he stepped outside, he saw a massive triangle-shaped object with yellowish lights at each apex and a bluish light in the center silently moving directly above him. There were 4 smaller objects, 2 egg-shaped, 2 round, moving erratically behind the triangle. He said the triangle appeared to have stars on the bottom of it, as if in an attempt to camouflage it, but due to its low altitude and the light from his home and the surrounding homes, he was able to clearly make out this object. Jones attempted to take a video of it, but the batteries on his camera immediately died. He grabbed a second digital camera to at least get pictures of it, but that battery died instantly too. Sounds a lot like the Scarsdales. Sorry, the Bass team at the Scarsdales. Wanting to get a better look at this thing, Jones ran inside and got a high-powered flashlight. Thankfully, the batteries weren't dead, and he pointed the flashlight at the triangle. Immediately in response, an intense bluish-white light, roughly 2 to 3 feet in diameter, shot out from the center light of the triangle and hit him. Ooh. Jones turned away and crouched down to shield himself from the light, but it was so hot that it felt like it was burning his neck and shoulders, so he ran into the house. From inside his home, Jones watched as 2 of the smaller objects abruptly shot straight up into the sky at an incredible speed and disappeared. Next, the large triangle rotated onto its side with the base of the triangle pointed directly at Jones, making it appear to him like a black rod. It too shot straight up into the sky at an incredible speed and disappeared into a swirly vortex-looking thing. Within minutes of the encounter, Jones came down with a severe headache, extreme nausea, and felt weak. Still, before going to bed, Jones logged onto the MUFON website and filed a report, who then passed the info along to Bass. The next day, Jones couldn't get off of his couch and reported having a metallic taste in his mouth. Not only that, but his mouth, neck, and upper shoulders were sore and appeared to have a severe sunburn. At 2 a.m. the following day, Jones was woken up by several low-flying helicopters buzzing around his house. 5 hours later, the quintessential Men in Black knocked on his door. Jones answered, and the Men in Black quickly brushed past him and asked to talk to him about his sighting report. Jones agreed, but said that their talk quickly turned into an interrogation. After about 40 minutes, the men stood up, told Jones not to talk about what he saw, and quickly left in a black sedan with white license plates. A few days later, Jones pulled into a gas station and realized that the same black sedan had pulled in behind him. This time, he got the plate number, which he passed along to Bass, and using their resources, determined that the car was from a specific Department of Homeland Security carpool. About a month later, Jones still didn't feel good, so he went to the doctor. And the results weren't good. Like Mr. Becker, his blood showed profound abnormalities. By October of that year, lumps began to appear all over his legs, groin, and back. By the end of February, the lumps had grown considerably in size and pain level. 20 more lumps would appear at the rate of 2 to 3 a month until almost a year after his encounter, when 24 of the lumps were removed for examination. Local physicians diagnosed Jones with non-malignant lymphoma, but the surgeon told a Bass-contracted physician that he'd never seen anything like it in his 22 years as a board-certified pathologist. Quote, in early June 2010, the Bass-contracted physician told Kelleher that his working hypothesis was that Jones's lymphoma was consistent with the biological effects of being irradiated by about 300 gray, end quote, which in layman's terms is a load of radiation. 450 gray is fatal. Okay, so remember Dr. Hal Puthoff, the guy who did Project Stargate, the CIA's remote viewing program? Well, during Stargate, remote viewers occasionally came across exotic events and technologies that were relevant to what AAWSAP Bass was studying. For that reason, AAWSAP tried to get remote viewing to be part of their research, but weren't able to primarily due to funding. However, they were approved to do a few remote viewing tests here and there. So, in March 2010, Joseph McMoneagle, one of the US's premier remote viewers from Stargate, was asked to observe a target designated 22610. Unbeknownst to McMoneagle, it was Skinwalker Ranch. As expected, McMoneagle drew a very accurate map of the ranch and provided very detailed information about the animals there, as well as the 2 ranch managers and 2 of the security guards. But then, McMoneagle described a 5th man, whose features he couldn't really make out. All he could gather was that this 5th man was 4'3", between 60 and 70 pounds, of undetermined age, and hairless. He added that the ranch personnel couldn't see the 5th man, but that communication attempts were made by him, but that the communication was unclear and would appear to come from behind and above their heads. 1 year into AAWSAP, things were going really well. They'd made a ton of progress, produced some very detailed reports, collected a lot of data, and generally, everyone was happy with the direction it was heading in. After a briefing from Bigelow on AAWSAP's progress, Senator Reed became very concerned that Bass was about to end up on DoD's radar, which would expose the AAWSAP contract and open it up to opposition from people within DoD. Not only that, but the DIA and Senator Reed had it on pretty good authority that Russia and China had been running their own AAWSAP-like programs for decades. And it's pretty widely known that whoever figures that stuff out first wins the world, basically. So, Senator Reed wrote a letter to Deputy Secretary of Defense William Lynn, highlighting the pressing need to make AAWSAP a special access program, as well as the added benefit to the DoD for doing so. Making AAWSAP a special access program would accomplish 3 things. Number 1, It would protect the program and its information from people snooping around into what they were doing. Number 2, it would secure their funding. And number 3, it would give them access to other relevant special access programs. From the very beginning, everyone in AAWSAP took a lot of measures to protect the program from, quote, the usual hordes of bureaucratic parasites and bottom feeders that were endeavoring to purloin some of the contract's money, end quote. Whew. Because this would be an unclassified document, Senator Reid used a nickname that they'd created for AAWSAP. That nickname was ATIP.
The name ATIP was a nickname for AAWSAP for certain security reasons, but the difference between AAWSAP with the nickname ATIP at DIA and ATIP at the Pentagon is quite distinct. AAWSAP had $22 million of funding. It covered military and civilian UFOs, yielding a massive database. It also had a main contract and subcontracts. Now, ATIP in the Pentagon, as described in the articles, was basically zero funded, looked at specific military UFO encounters and very important ones because they had film, and it had no contract. So getting back to how did this mix-up occur, I think it's not deliberate. It's not due to authors, to television personalities, etc. It's the fact we were running not an official SAP, but a closed program. I can tell you for a fact that within my own office, they did not know, except leadership, that this contract was being run. They had no idea whatsoever. Our security was that tight.
A meeting was held to decide whether or not to submit AAWSAP for special access consideration. But within an hour, they decided to postpone making that decision and never revisited it. Not acquiring SAP status was a major blow to AAWSAP and would soon prove to be fatal to the program. By the end of their second year, AAWSAP had delivered in spades. They'd submitted to the DIA thousands of pages of technically rigorous investigative reports on UAP and other anomalies, not to mention those 38 DIRDs from Project Physics. And they'd created the largest UAP database in the world that consisted of over 200,000 UAP-related cases that had been meticulously and rigorously investigated and cataloged into 11 databases. But despite all of its success and 5-year approval, AAWSAP was cut short due to a lack of funding. Then in 2011, an opportunity arose, thanks to Senator Harry Reid, for DHS to receive $10 million in funding. Because AAWSAP wasn't strictly a defense-oriented program, Dr. Lacatski gave a very in-depth briefing on AAWSAP to officials at DHS that was very well received. So, Dr. Lacatski collaborated with Senator Reid to create an AAWSAP-like program for DHS. But in the end, DHS chose not to accept the $10 million in funding. So that was the end of that. But even if they had accepted the $10 million in funding, it's very unlikely that they would have taken on this AAWSAP-like program. At that time, DHS was still a relatively new agency, so they had some legitimate concerns regarding the optics of taking on a UFO program when they were still struggling to be taken seriously by the other government agencies. Not to mention, a couple of the higher-ups at DHS tried knocking on the doors of at least 2 other agencies to talk to them about UAP-related stuff, and they were treated very rudely and basically had the door slammed in their faces. It also left those officials convinced that, quote, advanced technology was sequestered under government supervision at aerospace contractors' facilities. As a result, the DHS officials became very hesitant and even fearful of moving forward, end quote. Despite the setbacks, Dr. Lacatski and others were undeterred and tried for the next 2 years to lock down DoD funds for the program, but failed to do so. And in 2016, Dr. Lacatski retired from government service. And that's the story of AAWSAP, the largest acknowledged UAP study by the U.S. government. I want to know what you guys think. Do you think UAPs and paranormal phenomena are linked? What do you make of the hitchhiker effect and the very predictable pattern of paranormal activity that's associated with it? Leave all of your thoughts, opinions, and your own paranormal or UAP-related stories down in the comments. If you liked this video, please consider liking it. Thank you for watching, and I'll be seeing you guys again soon. I gotta record a video. This is why I don't get any work done. I gotta record a video now. How am I supposed to put him down? I can't. Alright, I guess we're just gonna record it like this for now.